3 years after the release of The Caves of Steel came the sequel, The Naked Sun. As with the first novel, Isaac Asimov used his characters of Elijah Bailey and R. Daniel Olivaw in a mystery which involved robots. The difference this time was more than just the murder to be solved, but where the murder happened. The first was the spacer area of Earth, a different but nevertheless terrestrial area for Bailey to go. But this time, it would be on a spacer world itself. The start of the book puts the focus on where the true problem Bailey faces is, inside himself. The first novel had been adamant that the humans of Earth had reached a point where going outside the cities was unthinkable to them, almost as certain as the inviolate nature of the 3 laws of robotics. And yet, Bailey had in the end come over to the side of the Spacers, well, that faction that we'd been dealing with in the murder anyway, that for the human race as a whole to survive, humans from Earth had to begin resettling the galaxy. He'd suggested advancing this very agenda in lieu of punishing the murderer in that case. But what The Naked Sun shows is that just because someone believes in something doesn't mean that they can simply stop being affected by ingrained experiences. It begins with Bailey's notable discomfort merely in using an airplane to fly from New York to Washington, D.C., a journey that bothers him not so much because of a fear of crashing, so much as a fact that for right now, he's barely shielded from the outside world. He has to convince himself that the plane is a tiny city in order to be able to cope with the situation. Just tell himself that he's not outside so that he can avoid open panic. This, as much as the murder he must solve, is the conflict that Bailey must overcome. There are 2 reasons why the book is called The Naked Sun, and this doesn't have to do with the murder. One of those is because Bailey must learn to face being exposed to the outside, to have nothing between him and the naked sun. The decision to have Bailey go to the world of Solaria, where the murder took place, is a politically dicey situation. Earth, you might recall, is the oppressed mother world of the Spacers, those humans who had left long ago with robots and through them created worlds of advanced technology and far greater leisure than back home. Solaria is that taken to its most extreme. It started merely as a summer home planet for a few rich spacers, but eventually it became the 50th spacer world, and it is the polar opposite of Earth. Earth is a world of 8 billion people, all living solely in gigantic cities. Solaria is a world of 20,000 and absolutely no cities, not a one. Instead, homes of no more than 1 to 2 people with huge tracts of personal land cover the world, mansions with whatever else is on their property that is needed, and robots to handle everything. One character, for instance, has his own factory on his estate, operated entirely by robots. Because of this isolation, viewing others through tridimensional viewing, in other words, holograms basically, is the way that things are done here. One doesn't appear at the home of another. In fact, this difference between seeing and viewing is a massive distinction for the Solarians. The same way that Bailey struggles to cope with the thought of being outdoors, the Solarians struggle to cope with being in the presence of others. The result of this is that there is little interest in sex, and only to ensure the continuation of the species rather than for pleasure or companionship. Marriages are assigned and based upon genetic compatibility, with the children raised in a central facility with no contact with their parents, who aren't bothered by this in the least. Marriage is already something that they barely tolerate and is seen as a distasteful civic duty. The last thing they want to do is have anything to do with children. This leads to the strangeness of the situation they found themselves in. There is no crime on Solaria. There's no need for any. You have more than you could possibly want. All your needs are tended to, and everyone is free to pursue their own interests with little interference from anyone. So with that, and no sexual intrigue in the mix, what reason is there to want to steal or harm? And even if one wished to harm another, that would require tolerating the presence of that person long enough to go about the deed. Any crime on Solaria was unthinkable, and thus a murder was even more inexplicable. And naturally, there's no police here, no one trained to investigate. This is why Solaria's chief of planetary security is left to look elsewhere to find help. and why Aurora suggested Elijah Bailey after his success with the murder back on Earth. After all, he'd proven not only to be a skilled detective, but also capable of discretion and of looking at the bigger picture. What this does is allows Asimov to turn his main character on his head. Take someone who last solved a mystery because he had resources he was familiar with, a setting he was familiar with, a culture he was familiar with, and operating with the parameters of his own life. Now he's on an alien planet with an alien culture, trying to solve a murder when he can't comprehend anything about the place. How do you determine a motive when you don't understand how people think? His consideration that the victim might be jealous of someone spending time with his wife is met by blank stares. And the idea that his assistant would kill him for promotion is met with literal laughter, because his job is the worst one on the planet if you're a Solarian. His remark that the planet's only sociologist might have done it after losing too many chess games to the victim is one of the more plausible motives, given that at least hurt pride is something a Solarian can feel, even if it's a ludicrous motive for murder. But one of the largest things for Bailey to overcome is his fear of exposure to the outdoors. He has partnered with Daniil once again, ostensibly to lend Bailey more credence by having an Auroran with him, because they're not telling anyone that Daniil is actually a robot. However, Bailey suspects that likely the reason Daniil has come is the same reason that Earth agreed to send him, to learn about the Solarians. The Solarians are renowned among the spacers for their skills in robotics, and it allows them to do as they please without interference from the other spacer worlds. But there is nevertheless concern among the spacers for their more eccentric cousins on Solaria. The other reason for the title, The Naked Sun, is obviously that Solaria is being completely exposed. Solaria obviously being derived from solar. As for Earthers, they projected that there's perhaps 100 years before everything on their world collapses unless something changes. So they're desperate to learn whatever they can about the spacers. They know that their long lives in robots are a huge advantage. But what are the disadvantages? In the end, Bailey concludes that these two are also the spacers' disadvantages. Their long lives sap their desire to take risk, push outward, and also to introduce fresh ideas. And as for the robots, their seeds are planted here for the abandonment of the sci-fi culture that had been mentioned in the first novel, the fusion of human and robot. The conclusion is gradually drawn that that's not going to work. Upon arrival, Daniil was aware of Bailey's fear of the outdoors, and so arranged transfer from the ship to the Groundcar in a way to prevent any exposure there, and then picked a model of Groundcar that could be enclosed. Solarians frequently enjoyed the outdoors, even if they didn't enjoy spending it in the presence of each other. Bailey knows that he will likely have to deal with the outdoors at some time, so he decides to confront the outdoors head-on by demanding to have the top lowered on the car. Daniil objects and even refuses a direct order on that point, despite the need for a robot to obey all orders. Daniil is convinced that in this case, the first law overrides the order, that for Bailey to see the outside would be to subject him to harm. Bailey has to trick Daniil in order to get the top down, and we see, of course, that Daniil is right. Bailey is overwhelmed and nearly damages his vision trying to outstare the sun. At a later time, Bailey insists on exposure to the outdoors, and manages for a time until he is suddenly overwhelmed and collapses, and Daniil must come to his rescue. Bailey is clearly harming himself, hence the robot's behavior. And it's fully justified, right? He's coming to harm, a robot's job is to prevent harm, therefore the robot's doing the right thing. And yet, Bailey is advancing every time he tries this, making it easier for him to tolerate the intolerable. In another instance, after the attempted murder of the head of security, Daniil objects to Bailey leaving the house, and again the first law compels him to override Bailey's specific orders, forcing Bailey to again trick Daniil in order to be able to leave. Again, just like with exposure to the outside, Daniil is in the right. Bailey really is placing himself in danger by leaving the house to investigate. There's an attempt made on his life at one point. And yet, had it not been for Bailey exposing himself to the outdoors, and for Bailey leaving to continue the investigation, he would have failed to solve the case. It was only by facing his fears and taking risks that Bailey was able to succeed, where taking the safe path would have surely led to failure. This is part of why the presence of robots was also a weakness for the Spacers. To do what needs to be done to expand requires overcoming fear and facing down actual danger, things that a robot subservient to the first law cannot abide. They must be blunted. Things have to be softened so that the nanny robots do not force us to remain where it is safe. Asimov subtly points to this by mentioning the robots that are used in raising the children on Solaria. Every child has a nursemaid who will accept destruction without a thought before allowing the slightest harm to come to a child. Which sounds ideal until the other half is brought in. Robots cannot discipline children. Robots struggle with understanding that a small amount of harm now can prevent a larger amount of harm later. Daniil seems the sole exception to this, and this is only because he has been programmed to think more like humans and had second law instructions to firmly back up the first law regarding Bailey's well-being, so that Daniil's entire purpose was committed to protecting Bailey. But otherwise, robots can't seem to grasp the need for harm now to avert greater harm later. Humanity is on a course of inevitable destruction, the ultimate harm. But our robots could not see beyond the harm in the immediate that must be accepted and endured in order to avert it. They'll protect us, and protect us right into our graves. Throughout this, of course, is the issue of the murder. The only possible suspect is the wife of the deceased, Gladia, since she is the only one who would be permitted into her husband's presence and who was at the scene of the crime. Except there was no murder weapon at the scene either. No way she could have carried out the crime. Gladia proves to be a major part of the case, naturally, starting with her casual sexual teasing of Bailey in their first viewing, where she allows him to see her nude and brushes it off as saying that it doesn't matter because it's just viewing. Daniil sees this as her attempt to influence Bailey and affect his judgment. And it probably is. But what transpires subtly reveals that there is more to it than that. The identity of the murderer is, last chance to stop me from spoiling it for you, is Gladia. But not exactly. The one considered morally responsible for it is the same one who attempts murder twice again, a robotics expert, because he is aware of what Bailey is aware, that the first law has an implication to it that is patently false. That a robot cannot harm a human being. In fact, Bailey notes, a robot cannot knowingly harm a human being, but a robot can unintentionally commit harm. A number of robots, carefully instructed by an expert, can commit a variety of murders, as Bailey notes. It's a matter of proper manipulation. The important point here is that when he confronts the robotics expert over it, the robotics expert insists it's not the robot that's responsible for the murder. Don't say that because people are paranoid about robots. The true murderer is the one who arranged everything. That's why I say morally responsible, and the same reason that Bailey leaps to the same conclusion, because this guy, like with the robots, manipulates Gladia herself. You see, Gladia, we discover over time, is a unique Solarian, a throwback in a sense, because she inwardly desires all the things that her society has abandoned: companionship, love, pleasurable sex. On Solaria, those are the thoughts of a perverted mind. She flirts as she does with Bailey because he's the one person on the planet willing to respond in the way that she wants, even if he isn't going to give her any of those things. He's a small sip of water to a woman who's dying of emotional dehydration. This is why Bailey sees the robotics expert as the true murderer, because he determined what Gladia was, and he used that against her. She was trapped and stifled, living in a society where she could tell no one but her husband what she wanted, and seeing only discomfort, even revulsion, in his expression. A complete inability to comprehend the deep-seated needs that she had as a person that were not being met. The constant stifling pressure with no outlet would lead her to erupt in emotional outbursts because she was a sane person trapped in a world that thought she was mad. So when the time came when she was so incensed by the prison that was her life and 3.5 centuries of that staring down at her, she had a dissociative incident, and in that moment was handed a weapon by a robot, which she used to smash the victim's skull in. Yet ironically, the man who wanted her to swing that weapon was hoping to destroy the last vestiges of the life she craved, wanting to devise technologies that could be used to force Solaria's way of life onto the rest of the galaxy. Because of that, Bailey once again covers up the one responsible for the murder, and even intervenes so that Gladia will be allowed to leave Solaria for Aurora, where she can be with people who won't see her desires as abnormal. The report on all of this pleases the authorities on Earth, but Bailey insists that Solaria is just an outlier, that it's not going to be nearly as much help as they think in dealing with the Spacers. Their belief that the Spacers will collapse and leave Earth free is groundless and ignores Earth's own growing problems. The only answer, he insists, is that he go to Aurora himself, the most powerful of the Spacer worlds. And he would do just that, as we'll see in our next book, The Robots of Dawn.